Pop quiz for all the loyal members of the Dadages friends and family. Do you remember what our dadage was regarding competitive advantage? Think about it, and the answer is right around the corner in today's episode of Dadages.
When I was your age, go ask your mother. I know you don't like it. It builds character. How many times do I have to tell you? I'm not just talking to hear my own voice.
Hello, listener, and welcome to Dadages. I'm your host, Chad Hagle, and if you are looking for some fatherly wisdom for your career, your family, or any other aspect of your life, then you've come to the right place. If you want to learn more about Dadages, find additional content, submit questions, or feedback to me, visit dadages.com. Thanks for being here. And before you listen to our podcast, please listen to your father. So, did you ace the pop quiz? What was the dadage about competitive advantage? You don't have to be the best in the world to succeed. You just have to be the best version of you. Remember? Rewinding back to our episode on competitive advantage, if you haven't checked it out, I might suggest that you pause here and take 20 minutes to go back and listen to it before continuing with today's interview episode. For those of you that have already listened to that episode, I'll begin today where I wrapped up that episode, sharing a few tips to maximizing your own competitive advantage. Those were the following: know your strengths, know your weaknesses, define your own success, evaluate progress based on your own growth and your trajectory toward optimal you-ness, assess and recalibrate frequently, and then acknowledge your success, share your success, and operate in gratitude for everyone around you. Today, we're going to really zoom in on the second point in that list. Know your weaknesses. And I think one of the best ways to gain much better perspective into your weaknesses is through coaching. Every one of us can use a good coach now and then. And today, we've brought you one of the best. Today's guest on Dadages is Marisa Murray. Marisa is an executive coach and leadership development expert and the CEO of Leaderly International, an organization dedicated to helping executives become better leaders. Marisa was a partner with Accenture and a VP at Bell Canada. Today, she is sought after for executive coaching and leadership development services for organizations including Molson Coors, Pratt & Whitney, and Queen's University. She's an author of 3 Amazon bestselling leadership development books, and today we're talking about her latest book, Blind Spots: How Great Leaders Uncover Problems and Unlock Performance. Well, with that introduction, Marisa, or perhaps I should call you Coach Murray, welcome to Dadages.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here.
Wonderful. And Marisa, right up front, blind spots. What are they and why should we be aware of them?
Yeah, well, blind spots are the things that we don't know are getting in our way. And actually, in the book, I define them kind of specifically as the gap between our intention and our impact. And I do that because I realized with that definition how prevalent they obviously are in leadership. Because in leadership, we're always very focused on our intention. We want to make an impact to our clients. We want to make an impact to our teams. We are focused on our intention, and our intention is invisible to those people, and our impact is invisible to us. And so in between that, there's a gap. And those gaps create blind spots. And I really do believe that leaders that consistently try to reduce the gap between their intention and impact are the ones that win in the end.
That's a fantastic explanation and very, very clear. Thank you. And as you said, blind spots, by definition, the impact is not visible to us. That's the real challenge, right? And so how does a good leader who wants to be self-aware and enlightened and try to address these things gain visibility to their own blind spots?
It's all about feedback, right? And that's what's really challenging for leaders, because every leader will tell you that the more senior they become, the harder it is to get feedback. We have positional power, we have perceptions that really matter, and people know that. And sometimes we don't get the feedback that we need. But ultimately, there's no way for you to know your impact because that exists in other people's heads. And so it is a question of becoming curious and creating an environment where people can share that information with you. And it also helps to share your intention more, because a lot of times if you share your intention, like as simple as, my intention for this meeting is to get in and out of here, update status, and like give you guys whatever resources you need, and then get you guys back to work. Even sharing that intention will make people kind of realize, okay, that's what we're doing, as opposed to not saying that and behaving that way. And then maybe the whole team sort of feels like they've been railroaded and it's been fast and they haven't had time to connect. And that somehow you're creating this really uncomfortable environment versus, just trying to, share your intention. And then, they might actually, say, like, that was my intention. What was my impact? You can ask. And they might say, well, your impact was we felt really tired after this meeting and you kind of negatively impacted our productivity, And so then it's like, oh, okay, well, fascinating. What's the tiny action I can take to align this? And sometimes it's so small. It's just like, well, we could have said hi first, or we could have just had an open round table, or we could have added to the objectives of the meeting. It can be these tiny, tiny, tiny tweaks that make such a difference between narrowing that gap.
Or perhaps nap time.
Yeah, sure.
So you used three
Absolutely.
really powerful words in what you said there. Communication. I mean, communication is everything in life and in human interaction and in business, of course. Feedback. And someone told me one time that while Wheaties may be the breakfast of champions, feedback is the true breakfast of champions. And I think that really applies in a corporate setting. And then you talked about intention. And I want to come back to that because all of this is really about intention and awareness. And you and I are both yoga practitioners. I've practiced for 18 years now. And intention is one of the fundamental aspects of yoga. What is your intention? What are you bringing to this practice today? And what's interesting is I've thought back after reading your book, I've thought back to all of my yoga classes, and there's such a focus on intention, intention, intention. And I don't ever remember one of my yoga teachers making that connection and bridging that gap that you've talked about between intention and impact. It's the intention and then the action, the carrying out of the steps of the practice. But then the question is, what is your impact when you are on the mat and then when you step off the mat? Have you had this brought into your yoga practice ever? Or have you ever raised your hand and said, wait, we're missing something here?
No, but I love this. I love this because absolutely, I think that I sort of dove into yoga as a stress management and a physical and all those kinds of the reasons why we go. And then we get so much more out of it in terms of just the whole journey of development as a human. And I loved the intentionality of each practice. And I agree with you that, every pose can be so different just in small kind of actions. And our impact in the world is transformed after a really, really good yoga session. What's interesting in where I haven't made the connection is that, I don't run around and sometimes ask. I mean, my family probably knows. My kids at one point, I don't remember the context, but I had been skipping yoga for a bit or something, and I was kind of stressed out, and they started chanting at the table, yoga, yoga.
It's time, Mom.
So clearly they made the link between intention and impact as it relates to yoga. But it's a really great point.
That's a great story. And awareness is certainly at the foundation of yoga as well. The principle of awareness in Sanskrit is referred to as chit or chaitanya, and everything really starts from awareness. And it's really, the word yoga itself means yoking or connection, and it's connecting breath to movement. And that's the awareness that you practice when you're on the mat is the awareness of your breathing, the awareness of everything that's going on inside and outside of your body. And so I really like this idea that we're talking about of, as I said, carrying that beyond the mat. And as you said, carrying that impact into your life. What do you feel that your study of yoga was involved in you finding your path to studying blind spots and awareness and impact so closely?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite Sanskrit word is drishti, the focal point. And, I remember very distinctly being kind of at a bit of a pivot point with my corporate job. In yoga class, we were doing a balancing pose and they're like, find your drishti. And I sort of found my little focal point. And then she made us close our eyes. So then she's like, okay, hold the balancing pose, closing your eyes. And I closed my eyes. And of course, as soon as you close your eyes, it's amazing the difference in terms of how difficult it is to hold the balancing poses. And that metaphor for me was like, wow, this is how I feel at work right now. I feel like I don't have a drishti. Like I felt like that thing. And I went home and I literally started to say like, I know what I need to do. I need a new drishti. Like I don't have it. So in fact, it was a really, really enlightening moment for me.
It's such a great metaphor. I mean, what I'm thinking to myself right now is if you don't understand how destructive blind spots can be or disruptive, try to stand on one leg and close your eyes.
Yeah.
And make everything a blind spot all of a sudden.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
That's such a great point. And this idea of drishti, focusing, it leads me to a question, which is focusing on blind spots or weaknesses a negative? Is that a negative mindset? Shouldn't people just be positive and focus on their strengths, or what's wrong with that perspective?
Yeah, so I love strength finders. I love helping my clients harness and identify their strengths and really lean into that. And I think that is, when you're at your best, all your strengths are empowering a lot of that. The challenge is that our blind spots are often hidden behind our strengths. So most people sort of intuitively know this because they're kind of like, well, I love this about you, even when you get feedback, like, I love this about you. And yet when, this is sort of this shadow side of that strength. And it's not that we're not strength focused. You absolutely are strength focused, but there's very, very interesting nuances, and that next level of awareness kind of helps you calibrate, like, how is this absolutely experienced as a strength versus those sort of shadow sides that often accompany our strengths. And our blind spots are often hidden behind our strengths, which makes them hard to see. It makes people hesitant to tell you about them because they actually really don't want to break you. Right? Like, so there'll be, things like, you're very inspirational and it's really great to listen to you. And yet you underestimate how hard something is to do. And so they're sort of afraid. They don't want to break the visionary and the inspirational nature, but they do actually need you to help bridge to the execution or have the awareness around that. And so I do think it's not about focusing on weaknesses. It's really about trying to understand what are just sort of the shadows of your strengths. And then how can you tweak, in very small ways so that the strength is experienced at its full force.
Yeah, you related it to the notion of giving feedback to others. And I think it's so much easier sometimes to give feedback to others versus analyzing ourselves. And the rule of thumb when you're giving feedback to someone else is what they refer to, and I'm sure you've heard this expression, the feedback sandwich, that you start with the positive, then you go to the negative, and then you finish with another positive. And so maybe that's something we can think about in terms of evaluating our own weaknesses wrapped inside of our strengths, is that weakness is the slice of bologna in between the two slices of bread. And we've got to work our way through the bread to find the bologna.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I'm not a big advocate of the sandwich just because I think people are always expecting the sandwich, right? Like they're just sort of like, and so I try to, in my TED Talk, I talk about appreciate, align, augment as sort of a formula for communicating. And so I recommend that people like appreciate the strength, right? Share the strength and align with the intention as much as you can. So if you can sort of say like, I so appreciate your advocacy for my career, and I totally align with your intention to position me in this new role. But what I would add is, I'd really like to do this. So then you augment, right? So then I'd really like to do this, or I really see my skills here, or I really see it this, so it's not a bad framework for feedback too, where you can just sort of like add some ideas, add some suggestions. Now, the reason why I kind of flipped the sandwich, it's like bread, bologna, and it's because bologna. I think
maybe a little messy, but still fun.
Because I do think that we have to prime that trust and that sort of that safety. And I do find if you're doing bread, bologna bread, it's just, people just, I don't know, the palate is just a little bit different. Whereas if you kind of warm them up a little bit more, I think it's easier. And the other thing is,
we all love carbs. Load them up with the carbs.
Yeah, that's what it is. Exactly. And I think that's the thing too, with this idea of augment. When you're providing feedback, you're providing data. And I try as a former engineer, I try to think of data as quite neutral. Like data is just data, and it's one data point, and you want a scatter plot. Like a good scientist has a scatter plot, and there are outliers, but those outliers are still important for the trend line. And so I do think it's really important for us to people talk about, I like feedback, but but it needs to be constructive. Like it needs to be, we have all these reasons to throw it out. And for me, it's like, it's just put it on the scatter point, put it on the scatter plot and just see where the trend lines are and be courageous about that. And the other piece is remember that what gets us defensive is that we think our intention is being attacked. And no one is they are not attacking your intention. People will obviously say, I know you had a positive intention, but this was the impact on me. It's funny, just with the kids, I'll probably share with your audience around, I built this little feedbackfriend.ai tool that people can go in and put just anybody's email addresses in and get some themes of blind spots. And I was testing it with my developer and I was like having to give it to like all these people like to try to test it. So I sent it to my kids and my husband and my sister-in-law. And anyway, just a whole bunch of people. Of course, it consolidates it and it makes it kind of confidential. But I went back with the terms and I sort of interviewed my children to see sort of which were the themes that were directly geared from them. And one of the funniest ones was she has a tendency to be really excited about you doing something. And then when you don't want to, make you feel guilty that you don't want to do it.
But you're not as excited as she is. Yeah.
Exactly. And so it's that whole thing, like keep the enthusiasm, keep the energy, excitement, but don't make people feel guilty or don't make people feel guilty if they don't have that same alignment, right? So there's these little things that, are like, yeah, my intention is good. My intention's for everybody to have fun and for us to do really fun things together as a family. And it is blind spot for me to realize that like my getting disappointed that they're not like as enthusiastic is disruptive to them. It's not a great feeling for them.
I can understand that. There's an impact to that you, again, wouldn't necessarily see until you get that feedback. And the one thing I would share, because I am kind of a linguophile and spend a lot of time analyzing what words mean and how words impact people in particular. And what I find is if no matter how many slices of bread you're stacking ahead of that piece of bologna that you got to give to somebody as the negative feedback, the one word that I advise people in my team to stay away from is but. Because if you've said 1,000 positive things and then you throw out a but, all those 1,000 things just got erased. Because the human brain, when the moment the word but comes out there, the brain skips everything that came before it and only listens to what came after.
Absolutely. It's like a delete. It's like a select and delete.
Exactly. So that's the one piece of advice I would add on top of all of that is if you're providing that stacked feedback, if you're going to make the transition to something that is more critical in nature, avoid the use of the word but. It's and I really need you to know this. And I think that it's a subtle change, but it means so much in terms of communication with people.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's so interesting because the only time but actually works well is when the positive, because but emphasizes whatever you're about to say. And so the only time it works is when you're like, you didn't make your bed this morning, which was really annoying, but I know you were really busy and great and that you're going to do it tomorrow. Like it works that way, right? Because the same delete around sort of the thing that was a little bit painful and then the encouragement around how to move forward. So it is a fascinating word. It really, really does make a difference how it gets deployed.
The last thing that I'll come back to before we move on, in this topic is, people often look at their limitations as weaknesses. But one of the things that I covered in a previous episode of Dadages is don't treat your limitations as weaknesses. Consider your awareness of them to be your source of strength. And I think that that's such an important point about this isn't really about focusing on negatives. This is about understanding nuances and important aspects of our behavior and its impact on others, as you said, and then being able to adapt them and use them as a strength moving forward.
I love that. I love the awareness of it is the strength as well. It's so true.
Yeah. And before we dive into some more specifics in the book, Marisa, I was provided some more of your background, and I was fascinated to read a little bit more about you. And I'd love if you could share more with the friends and family about how your career evolved from being an executive to being a coach and now an author of several books.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, starting out, I was an engineer out of school, a chemical engineer, and I worked in a bunch of manufacturing environments, as many engineers do. I did my MBA as I kind of got to more of a management level, and then joined Anderson Consulting at the time, which became Accenture, as a management consultant. That pivot there was kind of driven a lot by, I really loved the variety and I really loved the fast pace of project-based work. So my time at Accenture was really very suited to my character around, let's go in and figure it out and do work and then change. So I did that for, almost 15 years. And it was really fantastic in terms of the clients that I worked with, the transformations that I was able to learn about. And it was a very enriching time. And it got to a point where I was like, oh, I think I want to join industry. Like in consulting, you're always like, okay, I'm going to join the other side. And so it was time to do that. And I did that. And I really, as much as I adored many aspects of my switch to Bell Canada, I really found that I guess maybe a whole bunch of blind spots that were kind of in my way from really enjoying this particular role. It's really interesting. I talk in the book about, sort of, and I have the great pleasure right now actually of trying to teach my youngest son, who's 16, how to drive. And it's terrifying. And I have a brand new car and it's terrifying because he switches lanes without checking his blind spot. And when you're changing jobs, you are really switching lanes, and it's not easy to check all of your blind spots with your new roles. And so what became obvious to me during that period where I was just really unhappy was that there were a lot of things that I needed to work on in terms of my leadership that were a little bit masked because the environment that I was in had been so familiar. I'd grown up in an environment that had been really familiar. And I was having a really hard time just connecting and motivating my team in the same way and getting kind of the outcomes. Now, the bad part of the story is that I really got dared by my husband on a date over champagne to quit my job without a plan because he was just fed up of me being unhappy. And he was like, if you're unhappy, you should do something else. And so there wasn't a lot of reflection until I was on the floor of my bedroom being like, what the heck just happened?
What did I just agree to over champagne?
I know. Because now
if it's over champagne, you can't go back.
I know. Because now I was like, what do I want to do? It was like this really and I really didn't trust myself to pick another organization. I just really felt like there's something I missed in this. So I did trust myself to start doing consulting again, independent consulting, and because I was like, I know how to do that. But at the same time, I was really curious about what was it that was so difficult about this leadership journey I had been on.
And I'm curious, did you have the sense when you were there at Bell that there was something about the environment, the role, or the position that would have prevented you from trying to pursue an evolution to get beyond whatever the constraint was, the roadblock that you were dealing with at that time? Did you have to pull the cord and jettison in order to go through that growth?
No, I did not have to pull the cord and jettison, but there was so much pressure.
Yeah.
At the time. There was so much pressure. I was kind of brought in where there were a lot of clients that were unhappy and situations that needed immediate recovery. And, there was a lot of pressure, and I was holding
You're the hamster on the wheel and it's just going.
I was holding too much of that personally. And one of the things that was a blind spot for me that I think kind of got built by this energy around project and this energy around short-term projects is that it can get you to be a bit transactional about relationships and skip a lot of steps around building really thorough relationships. And so I came into Bell almost like this was a project, and it was too busy to build relationships. I was kind of rushed. And what I realized in hindsight,
it sounds like what you really needed in that moment was a Marisa Murray at your side to come in and provide you the coaching that you required.
Yes, really, because I was kind of on this mission to get results before the foundations of my leadership and the connections. And so, you are nothing as a leader without fellowship. You are nothing. You can't get anything done. And so that was, but that was not visible to me at that time. And yeah, absolutely. I really recommend to leaders that are doing major transitions to get what I call integration coaching, because I found that when people switch jobs, there's 3 gremlins that sort of plague them. The first is, did I make the right choice? And that's kind of constantly there. And it's very distracting in the subconscious mind, because you're kind of like, did I make the right choice? And the other gremlin is am I adding value? We want to add value way too fast, right? It's can you just figure out where the bathroom is and kind of get to know a few people before you're totally trying to add value. And the third is, am I being valued? And that's where you expect to have influence way faster. You haven't earned the desire to have influence. And those three gremlins, I think, are present for everyone, and they need to be managed. And it helps if you have a safe place to go to to help sort of stay on top of your gremlins.
Yeah, for sure. And these are not the cute, fuzzy gremlins. These are the ones that have been fed after midnight already and are wreaking havoc on your professional life.
Yes, they seem cute. That's what I like, the analogy of the gremlins, because they seem sort of innocent. Well, of course, I'm wondering if I have made the right choice. And of course, I want to add value and be valued. And they seem all sort of, but like, yeah, if you feed those guys,
if you feed them, you're in trouble. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I want to, advance now and get into the book itself. And I don't want to share all of the blind spots and the different categories you created, because I do encourage the friends and family to go check out the book for themselves. It's worth reading or listening to and getting the full picture, because you do such a great job in the book of not just conveying concepts, but really storytelling. You're an excellent storyteller in the way that you share narratives. And obviously, as you said in the book, you've changed the names and some of the key facts to preserve confidentiality of all of your clients, but you're very generous with sharing real experiences that people can relate to and understand, rather than trying to grasp with concepts that are difficult. And then you share really clear action items that help people then implement those things going forward for themselves. So we can't do all of that justice here today in an interview setting. And as I said, I do encourage people to go check it out for themselves. But I do want to dive into a few of the blind spots that you talked about that resonated the most with me and that were related to things that I've dealt with in the past, or some things I'm dealing with right now in my own organization. So let's start with one of them, outdated core beliefs. On Dadages, we've talked in the past a lot about the concept of limiting fallacies, and we introduced them in two different sort of complementary and reciprocal Dadages episodes. One was entitled, Anything Worth Doing is Worth Overdoing. And the other one was entitled, Just Because You Can Do Something Doesn't Mean You Can. And it's really focusing on capability versus capacity. It was sort of the juxtaposition of those bookend type of episodes. And I really look at these limiting fallacies as a type of core belief. They're things that we think about that stand in our way and that we don't even necessarily know is there, and don't necessarily know that this is what we believe, but it's really affecting how we act and what we do. Can you explain exactly what outdated core beliefs are in your vernacular and why they can be so troublesome?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love the examples that you give, because it's exactly that. I call them outdated core beliefs because they are core beliefs that used to be great. They were things that are often, well-earned, really solid beliefs. And then all of a sudden you're at a level or in a context or an environment where they're outdated and they need to be updated, but you don't really know you're running on them. And because your subconscious mind is running on them. So you're just kind of doing what you do. And a lot of times people actually call their outdated core beliefs their personality, and it's not really their personality. You can change a belief. It's actually just, I always think a little bit technically. So I just think about it's like an algorithm that I wrote in my mind. It's like a code that I wrote and it's running and I don't know it's running, but it definitely needs updating, right? So I run into outdated core beliefs and I give several examples in the book, but it can be anything from I have to do it all myself, which is, or no one's as good as me, or even just contextual things. Like there's an example in the book called Erica the Expert, and, that I need to be the expert all the time as opposed to enabling and elevating the team, right? So these things they're just outdated because it's no longer the case. And generally it's no longer the case because you've advanced in your career or the nature of your role has changed. And it does take a little bit of reflection of, well, what's the belief that's driving that? Because when we get impact statements, we basically hear that we're not having the perfect impact on other people, but then we kind of have to roll it back a little bit with a lot of reflection around what's the belief that I'm running here that needs to be tweaked so that my behavior does not sort of default to that.
I think that's really interesting. And I liked the example you gave on the technical side of things, how you explained that this belief is not truly a part of the essence of you. It's not part of your personality, your identity. It's something that's layered on top of it. In the technical example you gave, I'm thinking it's not actually your operating system. as you said, it's just an algorithm running on top of it. And you can hit Control Alt Delete and stop it at any time you want, but you've got to be aware of it in order to do that. And I think one of the stories that you gave that resonated the most with me, and I think it'll probably resonate with many other members of the friends and family, was Xavier, the extra miler, and the core beliefs that drove him almost to a point of no return and creating a lot of danger for him in his professional life and really his entire life. This brings me back to actually our most recent Dadages guest, and that episode will air just before this one, was with Minda Zetlin, who is the author of Career Self-Care. And she talked about a lot of these same concepts that you covered in this story of Xavier. And one of the things she said in her book is, we're victims today of a fallacy. We believe that if we keep on giving 110% all the time, somebody will notice the hard work and fix it for us. Tell us more about Xavier and tell us about this core belief that he had that drove him to the edge and what needed to be done to help sort of bring him back to center.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Xavier is a phenomenal leader. When I did stakeholder interviews and impact statements for him, they were completely glowing in terms of the impact he was having, in terms of the clients that he was having. You know, he was admired by his team in terms of his expertise. And there were just these little worries, tiny little worries that were like, but he works way harder than us. And he works all night when he lets us go to sleep, and he cancels his vacation when, and lets us go on vacation. And, he will like torment himself to always go not an extra mile, but an extra 500 miles on every single deliverable. And people were worried about his health. They were like, and he was already experiencing sort of high blood pressure and all kinds of things. And I actually also interviewed his wife, and, she was like, he loves his job. He's amazing. But we want to have a baby and, all this kind of stuff. And so it was really interesting because with him, it was a pattern that was printed in him very, very young. He really attached his identity to this idea of just really working really hard and really overachieving. So we had to find tricky ways to actually change that outdated core belief. We couldn't convince him that quality wasn't important. We couldn't convince him, that going the extra mile wasn't important. Those things were actually really embedded. But we started to find other parameters that were also sweeter. And he started to recognize that one of the comments I think that was really helpful for him is one of his team members said, if that's what it takes to reach that level, I don't want it. So he started to be like, oh, wait, what am I modeling? And I really want this person to move to the next level because they deserve it. And yet, what am I modeling? And so it started out we kind of unwinded some of the belief by his care for his team, by the appreciation. I mean, he was pretty touched by everyone really worrying about him as a person. I mean, that's, you don't always sort of get that. So it was a whole, we worked together for 8 months. Like, these things don't evaporate overnight, but it was that whole, awareness of his impact, awareness of the potential for his team, diving into how much he loved his team and how capable he felt they were, and how he was, by him reducing sort of, his intensity, how he was allowing space for them to rise up.
Definitely a success story. And it sounds like the right building blocks were there to create that success story, a supportive environment where there's mutual respect and mutual care between him and his team. And then obviously having a great asset in you coming to the table to help coach him through that very difficult time. And Xavier's situation is one I can relate to personally. It's definitely a core belief that has impacted me in my life. I was raised in a household where self-reliance and self-sufficiency were absolute. I learned to do things on my own and to never seek help and to always be the hardest working person in any setting. And while it served me well, it led to a lot of problems at different stages in my earlier life and career. And I definitely had to adapt later on to get to that comfort zone, particularly as you talked about that balance of having time and engaging with family. And I'm very fortunate that I was able to course correct myself in that way. And during the time that I was raising my boys, now they're moving on to the next stage of their lives, I was able to find that happy place. But that's what's so addictive about these core beliefs in a way, right? They serve us so well and they seem to really work right up until the moment they don't. Isn't that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's why I think we have to be compassionate with ourselves. We have to sort of be a bit like, because when they start to not work, it's pretty painful. It's pretty painful. And so you're kind of like, I should have known, like we kind of should ourselves, like we're kind of like, I should have known, or I should have seen this coming. And, it's like, no, it was working for you. It was a pattern that was working for you. And, we can be grateful to it. I always think like, it's like, let's be grateful for this core belief that was useful for a period of time. And now let's gently escort it and replace it with something that's more attuned to the present moment.
And some of them, outdated, may not always apply because it may just be inappropriate for this time, because there are certain things that you can leave and then you can come back to them and they may serve you well later. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think beliefs are not meant to be permanent. And unfortunately, the brain sort of grabs them. I mean, I always think about we form a belief because we want to feel certain about something that probably we can't feel certain about, right? Because if we had a fact, it would just be a fact. So we form a belief to kind of give us a sense of certainty. But then the brain interprets that belief often as like the last word. And it's not meant to be the last word. It's a belief that served us at a certain time, and we need to keep looking at them.
And as you're saying this, what I think about is Greek mythology. Mythology is created to explain things we can't explain, so as to give us peace and comfort that there is a chariot rider that is taking the sun across the sky every day, because we can't explain it at the time. So in a way, these things are mythologies, personal mythologies that we're creating for ourselves to try to get across these gaps. And, a lot of these things, as we've talked about, can come from very early in childhood and your formative years. And I'd like to, turn the mirror back to you for a moment, Marisa. And I'd like to understand a little bit more about you. You talked about hitting this sort of semi-crisis moment when you were at Bell, and you talked about having blind spots. Were some of those blind spots that you were contending with outdated core beliefs on your part? And can you trace them back to where they might have come from in your life that led you to that moment? And that's where we'll take a break for today, friends and family. Hopefully, Marisa and I have inspired you to go practice some yoga and grab yourself a feedback sandwich. Be sure to join us back here for the conclusion of this two-part episode with Marisa Murray. We'll pick up where we left off, and we'll also spend some time going through several of the key categories of blind spots captured in Marisa's book. Until then, remember, Dad may not always know what he's talking about, but he sure can sound like he does.